After a long break of 3 or so months, we are live. With me today is notable Canadian Mr. Francois Lalonde. Bonjour, comment ça va?
Bonjour, ça va bien, merci. Et toi?
Bien, bien. My high school friends will only get that far. well, je m'appelle Sam, je suis Australian. That's as far as we'll go. So, no, that's all good. So, yeah, so thank you, Francois, is joining us today on, I guess, an episode talking about learning a new army as someone who I am well known, or who is well known for jumping factions from time to time, allegedly. I mean,
Sometimes.
the rumor sometimes, sometimes they jump around. So, and also an educator in his professional career. Love to talk to him about learning, the process of learning a new army, and then maybe some tips and tricks for other people who look, new year, new army, right? Like WT season is starting to kick off. People are getting their factions and stuff like that along the way. So talk to you about what the process is on your end, and then what others can learn from. So, but before we get started, so Francois, for some ignorant Australians and New Zealanders who've maybe never heard of you somehow, some way, the notable Canadian himself, who are you, and like sort of what's your background in 40k?
Right, I'm of course the most notable of Canadians.
The most
I
notable.
Listen, I started playing 40k in 1994, so yes, I am that old. And back then I started playing fantasy first, and I want to say it was fantasy second edition or something. Back then you'd get a starter box and there would be cardboard models in the box. My
Hell yeah.
first box I remember that I got as a teenager was Grom the Pounce and his goblins against, I want to say, Altarian and his high elves. And so I
Beautiful.
started as a fantasy player. And then shortly afterwards branched into the 40k side. That was also one of the early editions. I couldn't tell you which one. But the box was, I'm pretty sure I was Dark Eldar versus Dark Angels, or maybe Blood Angels. Anyway, it was a very long time ago. And
Yeah.
and back then I was playing, of course, with my friends in my parents' basement. We had a green felt that my mom had bought that we put over a slightly undersized dining room table that was in the basement, and we'd put books under the green felt to make hills. It was
Amazing.
very, very technological there. And I played for years, not competitively, just with my group of friends. There'd be like maybe
That's
half a dozen of us in high school. I think that's a very common origin story,
Yep.
right? And then I went to university. Back then I was still in my hometown of Montreal, so I could still play with my friends a little bit. But when I went to grad school and moved to the U.S., moved to Boston, I didn't have room for Warhammer armies or really money to play Warhammer. So, and my dad was like, I can't store all your armies. You
Yeah.
can keep a couple here, but not everything. So I sold most of it. I still have some relics of bygone age from the early 90s in my house today, but most of it I just sold and I stopped playing completely. I always kept up with the lore and read the books because that was a big part of what I was interested in, but I was no longer a Warhammer player and then wasn't for years and years. And when I moved to Ottawa for work, one day I started thinking about Warhammer again, and there was a store that I would drive past. And I walked into the store and I looked at all the models, and there's a lot of nostalgia sort of bubbling up. And I thought to myself, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to paint. That's a nice, like, relaxing hobby. I need something zen to do for my mental health that's not in front of a screen. So I'm just going to be a painter. That's all I'm going to do. And that was 2018, I want to say, and now 6 years later, I have 14 40k armies and 3 Sigmar armies in my basement, and I play tournaments every month.
Yeah. Yeah, it's all hobbied up, right? They're all painted to a nice standard. That's all it is, right? It's definitely
uh,
no gaming along the
so I am still
way.
a
Yeah,
painter. I have
of
painted armies for painting, and I have painted
yeah,
armies for playing. So my tabletop armies look good from 4 feet away. But I also have models that I paint to paint because that might come as a shock to some people who only know the competitive player that I am. But
yeah,
I do enjoy painting to a high standard also. It's just that if you're going to be playing tournaments all the time and hopping armies every once in a while,
of
as we'll be
course.
talking about today,
Yeah,
you can't paint every single model to your highest possible standard. You'll go insane.
no,
So I have some, like I have a beautiful Deathwing army that's painted to a very high standard that I haven't played very often, but it looks great on the shelf. And then I also have some very basic tabletop, like armies full of trickery. I have a GSC army that is all speed painted, but through the magic of pigment powders and speed paint, actually looks incredibly amazing as long as you don't
Yeah.
pull it close to your eyes.
As soon as you get to the less than 1 feet away, that's when you're like,
Less than
"Ooh,
one
okay, that's
feet,
a,
suddenly
yeah,
it
yeah,
starts to
yeah,
lose a little bit of the wow
yeah,
effect. But if you're looking
yeah,
at it from across the table, it looks very impressive.
And that's what really matters, right? You're looking for that distance anyway, so it's all good. No, fantastic. Very sort of stereotypical story of sorts.
Yeah,
Start when
that's
you
a very common
but,
story.
yeah, you fit the form, you fit the prototype with the stereotype. So no, it's fantastic. So obviously, so Francois, you mentioned there 14 armies and plus some Age of Sigmar armies as well. So how it sounds like you obviously have quite a bit of a collection, and I understand you sort of jump armies a little bit, like without being rude, but you jump armies from time to
Yeah,
time. So
I'm not
how
ashamed
often
of
will
it.
you I'm not ashamed. Wear that proudly. So how often will you sort of change armies, like within a given season, like say? So obviously traditionally like ITC season, like a full year, or like is that how you sort of envision, I guess, a Warhammer season per se?
Yes and no. I don't chase the ITC. I
Sure.
don't. I don't travel enough. We don't have super majors
Yeah.
in Canada. The system being what it is, it would be
Yeah.
very, very difficult for me to chase the ITC. I'd have to fly to the UK and play in super majors. So I don't really think of Warhammer seasons in that way. Because
Yeah.
I'm a WTC player, I think more in terms of WTC years. And the
Of course.
closer we get to WTC, the more I get fixed on a single army, the one I will be playing for WTC, and then as soon as WTC is over, then a bunch of freedom opens up. But I think what I do and what I would recommend people do is I have one main army that I keep for very long periods. For me, it's Space Marines, and I've played Space Marines and I've been current with Space Marines and just like engaged intellectually with the Space Marine meta for basically years. It's the one constant in my life. It's my largest collection. I have actually because it's very stupid, but because I started as a painter and more of a lore guy, I have 4 different Space Marine armies painted into proper chapter colors. And then a few years ago, made my own custom scheme just because it was
Yeah.
ridiculous. I had 6 Redemptor Dreadnoughts and that was 3 too many. but I stay current with Space Marines and they're kind of my baseline, right? My comfortable. I
Of
can just
course.
go back to that, and because it's such a large army with so many data sheets, there's always going to be something that you can play. So,
Yeah.
and it's not boring because there's, especially if you branch out to the non-compliant chapters. I have Blood Angels, I have Dark Angels, I have Ultramarines. There's going to be something for you in there. So I keep that kind of constant. And in fact, I was looking back at my tournament history for the last few years in preparation for talking today, and over half of my tournaments in the last few years have been with Space Marines. So I
Sure.
mainly play Space Marines. The reason people think that I jump around so much, and I do, is because I'll play Space Marines for half my events, but then I'll play like another army for one event, and then another army for 2 events, and then another army for one event, and I will have over a year I'll play 6 to 8 different factions, but half the events will be Space Marines.
Sure.
And I think that helps because you at
Yeah.
least
Very.
have
Very.
one thing that you're grounded in and comfortable. And if you don't have time or you don't feel like learning something new, you can just go, I'll just default to Old Faithful and just go with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously with Space Marines, like in 10th edition as a whole, like you have that like a solid faction, and then you can split off to various sub factions within like your Blood Angels, Dark Angels, Space Wolves, whatever. But you have
Yeah.
that solid core, and mostly the
And
same. But
if you want to play
there's
melee, you play Blood Angels. If you want to play
yeah, yeah,
shooting, you play Iron Hands. You can very easily sort of branch out within the sub faction.
yeah, absolutely. And well, it sounds like you're well part of the subscription service that is Space Marines, and
Yeah.
you're well.
Okay,
I know you. Yeah, yeah.
let's play a game. There's 3 of the generic Space Marine data sheets that I do not own. Which ones are they? Do you think?
3 generic Space Marine data sheets that you
Of
do
all of the
not
Space Marine
own.
data sheets, 3 of them I don't own.
Oh, you know, like is like a chaplain in Terminator armor would be like a random
No,
one.
I have
Like,
that.
okay, well that was a guess.
All right, let me help you.
Obviously,
What
yeah, oh, good.
Primaris units were released not too long
Oh,
ago that are the worst units in the game?
see, look, I'm not a Space Marine fan.
Ah,
This is
okay.
actually
All right,
part
all
of.
right, all right.
I'm a filthy Xenos and a Chaos enjoyer, but
You've heard of
no,
the Fire Strike turret, I assume.
oh, of
It's
course,
a
yes, of
tech
course, yeah,
marine
yeah, yeah,
sitting
yeah, yeah,
behind
yeah,
a
nice,
laser
yeah, yeah, yeah,
cannon.
yeah, 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 of course, yeah, yeah.
So I don't have
Fair enough.
that.
Surprise. Yeah.
I don't have the Hammerfall bunker, and I
Oh,
also don't have a
okay.
Land Raider Crusader. But everything else I got.
Fair enough. There we go. Well, I mean, look, you just like quickly switch out the weapons, right, for the Land Raider, and you're basically 99% of the way there.
You could, yeah. The Land Raider Crusader has like a giant storm bolters to
That's
the
right.
side,
That much.
hurricane
Oh,
bolters
yeah.
to the side. So
Yeah.
I'm sure it could be magnetizable, but my Land Raiders are all glued together. So
That's right. Well, the Hammerfall bunkers don't exist because we're WTC players through and through. That terrain features that
they don't exist.
so
Yeah.
they don't exist. No, fantastic. So but yeah, so you have that same core, and so is it fair to say like? How many would you say you switch to? Like, so you switch quite often, I guess, a little bit, just to
Yeah.
sort of please your brain. Yeah. So, like, is there generally a number you would put on it, or to be like in the 10, 15, 10, 15 armies maybe within a given year?
No, that's slightly less than that.
Yeah, sure.
So I own 14 factions, but some of
Yeah, yeah,
them I don't enjoy the playstyle of. I
sure.
have them for historical reasons, and
Yeah,
also
of
like
course, fair.
Imperial Guard. I love Imperial Guard, the lore. I love the feeling of like normal humans facing the horrors of the galaxy, but I don't enjoy the playstyle. So I have a Guard army. I have a Talarn tank column all painted up in the basement, but I
Beautiful.
haven't played Guard in years.
Yeah,
Over a year, like say an ITC
yeah,
season or WTC season or whatever, I'll
yeah,
play, I don't know, 5 or 6 different factions, probably.
yeah, yeah. No, fair enough. That's
Yeah.
but obviously being Space Marines being the core, then switching off
Yeah,
from
so
time to time. So
if you
yeah, yeah,
put all the Space Marines
yeah,
together, that counts as one.
yeah,
If you start
yeah.
splitting the Space Marines, then it goes up, of
Yeah,
course.
yeah, that's crazy, ridiculous.
Yeah.
So, how long? So, when you like choosing an army to play, like, what are some of your big key parameters that you decide on? Like, obviously, being a competitive player, the meta, and I guess the style of the book obviously plays an impact. Is that generally your philosophy?
Yeah, it needs to be good, right? I go to a lot of tournaments, and I go to tournaments because I like winning games of Warhammer and I like playing competitive Warhammer. And a lot of people just, I don't know, are afraid to say that for some reason. It's okay to go to events because you want to win games.
Of
That's
course.
kind of the
Yeah,
idea of a tournament.
yeah,
And so, whenever I switch to a new faction, it's because I think I can win with it. Unless it's just a one-off RTT, I'm not going to take something just because it's fun or wacky
yeah.
or like fluffy or whatever. If that's what you, the listener, is doing, that's great. That's just not how I'm wired, and
Of
it's
course.
important that we recognize how each and every one of us enjoys the hobby and plays Warhammer. So I will switch to a faction if I think it's strong enough to let me potentially win, if not the event, then at least most of my games. So I'm not going to play a weak faction just to give myself a challenge. That's stupid, I think.
Of course.
But other than that, I also just don't play something just because it's strong. Like in 10th edition, I have not played Eldar. And that was and I
Yet.
own it. I have an entire Eldar army. My first tournament win ever was with Eldar, which I think is a common thing as well. But I have all the Eldar. They're all painted nicely in an Ulthwé scheme, very lore appropriate as well. And I haven't played Eldar at all 10th edition because I'm on a team with a good friend of mine, Team Ditliff, who is just an Eldar main. So playing Eldar is a little bit of a waste for me because the next team event we go to, he's going to be playing Eldar. I'm not. So it feels like a bit of a waste of time. So
Of course.
in between those two extremes, like I'm not going to play Eldar just because I think it's strong, but also I want to play armies that I think are strong. Honestly, it's a mood thing. Like I switched to GSC for one event in December. Just that's my most recent
Hmm.
sort of foray into a different army, and I did it because A, they were strong, yes, but also I liked the look of it, and I wanted an excuse to paint them. And I figured,
Yeah.
okay, GSC are strong. I like the lore and the look of GSC. I have a Tyranids army, and I'm huge into Tyranids. They're like my second favorite army after Space Marines. And I never did GSC, but I love the look and the lore of GSC. They're really strong right now. Let's just paint a bunch of GSC. But I'm not going to paint GSC unless I have an event coming for GSC because I need that motivation. I rarely paint to paint, and when I
Sure.
paint projects to paint, it's going to be like a one-off mini that I just want to paint up and look good.
Yeah.
Painting 120 GSC infantry, I'm going to need proper motivation for that, and proper
Yeah.
motivation means I'm going to a tournament in Quebec City in like a month. Let's go. Let's paint 2,000 points of GSC in the next month.
Yeah, yeah. I think people who paint 120 neophyte bodies for fun as a hobby, that is the special sort of humans. Let's leave it at that. So
Hey,
fair
listen,
enough.
I
But,
find it kind of relaxing and zen.
of
Big
course,
fan
yeah,
of Army Painter speed paints. I will say,
they're
not
fantastic.
not sponsored, but I say good things about Army Painter speed paints any chance I get
Yeah,
because they
yeah,
are amazing. And
yeah.
I don't know, there's something about my brain. It's like back in the day, I used to be a long distance runner before I had kids, and I could run for 10 kilometers and just shut off my brain. And it's kind of the same thing when you're painting 120 neophytes. It's just you start painting and the brain shuts off, and I don't even listen to music or podcasts or anything. I just sit at the desk, start painting, and then I look up and it's like 3 hours later and I've painted 20
So, jeez.
neophytes. I'm like, all right, cool.
Woohoo! Yeah, fair enough. That's good. And so I guess just to take a step back there. So obviously you said GSC for example. So you said you're gonna have a goal in mind. You're gonna paint and stuff like. You're gonna learn the army, I guess, for an event. So what's
Yeah.
that process for you in learning the army? Like, what are some of your initial first steps?
Yeah. Learning styles are very personal. This is something that I talk about with my students a lot. We all learn in very different ways. So I can talk about what works for me, but that might not work
Yeah.
for you. Some of us learn best by watching, some of us learn best by doing. For me, I learn best by doing. And so when I'm learning a new army, I'll like read the data sheets, pull out the phone, read the app, of course, just try to get a rough idea of how something works. And maybe I'll watch a game or two, like a bat rep or two, but that's not how I get to grips with an army. I need to put it on a table or put it on TTS and just fumble around for a few games. And the first couple of games, you're going to be bad. It's very rare that I pick up an army and it just clicks right away. In fact, I don't think it's ever happened. It's going to take you a few games, and
Yeah.
everyone's different. Some people it happens faster than others. For me, I feel like for an army, unless it's a really complicated one, after like 3 reps, I figure I roughly know what I'm doing, and after like 10, I figure okay, I'm really good with this army now. I know what it does, and then after like 20, I feel like I can actually maybe be a quote unquote expert in the sense that there's not a ton of things that I'm going to get wrong anymore. But it's a process, right? First time you put an army on the table, you're gonna have a rough time, and that's normal.
Of
And
course. Yeah.
so
Of
you
course.
should do it in an environment where you feel safe and comfortable doing that. So for me, it's usually going to be in my garage with one of my friends, and I'm very lucky to live in an area with a very high population of competitive players and a bunch of current or past WTC players and very serious tournament goers. So I can just call one of them up and they come to my garage and we play a game. If you show up to an event having never played an army, maybe it works out. I've certainly done it before and had my practice games be around was 1, 2, and 3 of the event, and sometimes it works, but usually it doesn't.
Yeah.
So for me anyway, it's just playing as many games as possible, and of course we all have time constraints. You can't, unless you are unemployed and live on TTS, play 100 games before every event. But like at least get like 3 to 5 before you show up to the event. That's like the minimum, I think.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Yeah, and so to deep dive a bit more of that process. So those initial practice games, do you set yourself certain parameters, and do you try and do, I guess, different things than what you would normally do to try and learn the army? Like, are you trying to, I guess, stress test like first up? I know traditionally some people when they first try like an army style or detachment, like let's stress test, let's go balls to the wall, full send to start with, and then start scaling it back. Or do you do an opposite approach, like, or is it something else that you try and do while usually testing an army?
Going wild in a practice game has a lot of value, but I don't think that should be your first thing. It's okay to do it to test things. I
Sure.
played a bunch of games with my friend Ridvan Skari before his LVO run, and he likes to go. We're testing things. Let's go, and he's just going to do something wild and see what happens.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of value to that. But I think if you're just learning a new army, you should try and go into it without too many expectations. Sometimes
Sure.
people have an idea of how the game should unfold, and then when it doesn't unfold the way that they think that it should, I mean, they suddenly get frazzled and they have trouble like recovering from that. I think you should, especially for the first few practice games, go into it completely open minded and just see what happens. And also, this is something very specific about practice games that I think is important. You should be playing with someone who, A, knows that you're trying something new and trying to learn something new, and is willing to reset and do takebacks. Because some people say that they need to be punished, otherwise they don't learn. I think those people are full of shit. I don't think that's how anyone actually learns. I think if you make a mistake and immediately realize it's a mistake, don't struggle bust through the next two turns and then just slowly lose the game and waste the next hour just going, oh my god, I made this mistake. If only I had not made this mistake. Just go to your opponent and say, this is a practice game. This doesn't matter. It's not a tournament game. Winning or losing this game does not matter in the slightest for either of us. Okay, this was obviously stupid. Let's run it back. Like, let's go back to the game state 5 minutes ago and see what happens if I do something different. And those to me are the most worthwhile practice games because you can run up to the wall, and then if you run into the wall, you're like, okay, that was a mistake. Now, let's go back and see what happens if I don't do that. And you have to be willing to offer your opponent the same grace as well. For me, whenever I'm doing practice games, whether it be for an upcoming event or for WTC or for whatever, I think both players learn best if they're allowed to take things back. And so, yeah, just do that.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. Funny enough, you mentioned that take things back. There was a practice game literally on Thursday. Like we were both learning a new army, and there was a small like misdeployment on the vehicle. Like you just didn't put it fully in the training feature, instead of like hanging over. And I said, look, this is a mistake here, and just made the take back because it's this, and this. We saw what would happen. Just move it and just make changes. It's great when you can just make those simple in real life changes nice and easily. So
yeah, and if it's the final of a super major and you misdeploy your tank, maybe I'm still going to shoot it, of course. But if it's a game in my garage with absolutely no stakes, then as the other player, you also don't benefit from exploiting those mistakes because you're like, all right, well, if I'm going into an event, my plan can't be my opponent will make mistakes. I mean, everyone makes mistakes, of course, and exploiting mistakes is a big part of 40K, but your plan can't be my opponent will misdeploy. If they do, great. But you also need to know how the game goes if they don't.
No, absolutely. So in setting those parameters, obviously, I guess getting practice games and doing takebacks and stuff like that. What would be sort of those initial first games? Are you generally like running a meta list archetype or something like? What's your process for even trying out the army? Like, what's your first list that you're taking?
I'm shamelessly stealing someone's list. It's especially when you're just going from scratch, learning a new faction. Don't reinvent the wheel. If you don't know the faction, you don't know what's good. So just go to a faction expert. If you know them, if they're your friends, a lot of my friends are faction experts. I'll just reach out to them and go, please give me a list, and then start from there, and then maybe start adapting it to my style later on. But even if you don't have a direct line to a faction expert, just go on BCP, find a list that did well at a GT, and copy it right fully, every single thing, until you've played at least a couple of games. You actually don't know what is good. And I myself don't consider myself a very good list writer. This is not one of my strengths at Warhammer. In fact, it's one of my weaknesses, where I'm not the best at innovating new lists. What I'm really good at is taking someone's list, looking at it, going, oh, I know what this does. This is brilliant. Let me take it, then play with it, and maybe tweak it to my own personal style a little bit. But if I try to start from scratch, I'm probably just going to write a worse list. Now, so some people are just naturally great list writers, and they will just innovate constantly and be good at it. I am not one of those people, so I just shamelessly steal meta lists. Yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. And so, what do those initial conversations look like? Do you sort of like, if you can reach out to the person, so for example, let's say you were going to try and play Elder. Look, obviously, you have a very profound faction expert in Tim Deetlifts.
Yeah.
Look, he has his own play style and the way he does things. But what are some of those initial questions you ask him when you say copying a list? Are you saying, how does this try and play? What are some big key combos? What are the strats you should rely on? Is those some of the questions, or are there some other questions you try and ask?
Yeah, those are the main ones. If I'm lucky enough to be playing a faction, like my latest sort of foray into a new faction was GSC. So I called up Dustin Henshaw, who's a local Canadian, who's a very well-known GSC
Yeah.
player. I'm sure your listeners know of him, and I'm lucky enough that he's my friend. So I can just like reach out and say, Dustin, I want to try GSC. Can you please talk me through how this list plays? And GSC, of course, has many different playstyles. Dustin's playstyle is very different from mine, but Dustin knows that I like to play the high-speed melee pressure, so we were talking about Biosactic, and I was like, all right, Biosactic, I think this is good. This is how I think it plays. Can you please like tell me if I'm right or wrong? And then he gave me some pointers and he told me what the good matchups were, what the bad matchups were. He said, as long as you don't run into Death Shroud spam, you'll be fine, which of course I did round two of the event.
Nice, nice.
And then he also said, so if you play this army, this is how you should approach it, and that army, this is how you should approach it. And this was incredibly valuable and probably cuts down my need to practice tremendously. So if you're lucky enough, of course, to know someone who can help you learn, use that resource. But even if you don't, you can find some of that online through YouTube videos, bat reps, podcasts, or just play more. Like just because you don't have a direct line to a faction expert doesn't mean that you're not going to get there
No.
eventually. It's just a nice little shortcut because being able to call up Dustin and say, Dustin, help me out here, probably cuts out like at least 10 practice games out of what I need to do to get to the same point.
Yeah, absolutely, and like you learn as well from talking to Dustin or the other faction experts. Like more, maybe most importantly, don't touch the hot stove sort of moments. Like, don't do this. It's probably
Yeah.
a really bad idea. So that's probably the more
it's
important ones. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So and like I think discords as well are very good. Like I know traditionally in the past, like very paid discords. Yes, it's a barrier to entry, but generally very good information comes from behind there. And you can start like learning a bit more information. So I guess during those initial games, when do you start to like tweak a list, or when would you like to start making changes? Because sort of to revert back a bit from the conversation, I know your good old mate Ridvan Oskari. So traditionally, I know he's always historically said he'll play like 20 to 30 games of the same list before he tries to make any changes. Now that may be a bit more embellished, and most realistic humans won't have the patience to play 20 to 30 games to do that. He's a special one for sure in multiple ways, so he can do that. But how many games would you try and play before you maybe try and change something, or you cull it completely if because something doesn't align?
Yeah, so for regular human beings who are not,
Yes,
who don't make their living playing nothing but Warhammer, 20 games before you change your list is completely unrealistic. So do
absolutely.
not listen to Scary on that
Yeah,
one, unless you have the kind of free time to let you play as much as he does. But
you're an
very few
unemployed
people
TTS
do.
player.
For yes, sure, exactly. So for me, I honestly I probably tweak my lists too much. But generally, I think it would be good advice to give a list at least 3 to 5 games before you start making adjustments. And when you do make adjustments, they should be small. Small as in a few hundred points. If you're swapping out 1,000 points of your lists at a time, you're not giving yourself the chance to learn much. I don't think. But I'm also very impatient, so I tend to probably swap things out faster at a more rapid pace than I should. Um, so even with my sort of main stable faction, Space Marines, there's so many choices that I tend to do that. Though recently, I've actually found myself in a very unusual spot where I have this Space Marine Gladius list that I love so much that I've played it for like almost 40 games now, and I don't want to change anything about it, which feels extremely strange because that never happens. But yeah, give your list a chance, but also don't be afraid if something feels awful to just swap it out. You don't
Yeah,
have
that's
to
fair
bash your
enough.
head against the wall for 20 games, no matter what Ridvan says.
Yeah, no, and so also talking about so when things aren't going well, how long will you give a list or even an army a chance to sort of prove itself game wise? Will you take a couple of games before you try and change things drastically? Like say things aren't aligning or something's just not working out. Like is that 4 to 5 game range?
Yeah, something like that. And I think it also
Yeah,
depends what kind of reps you're getting, because some armies you'll just know are going to be tough. So I don't know. Right now, the list that scares me the most in the game is Guard Bridgehead with the new Guard Codex. It's not technically released, but we've all
Yeah.
played against it if we're doing serious practice because it's out there even though it's not tournament legal. So that's the list that scares me the most, right? So if I'm playing into Bridgehead and losing, well, that's maybe normal, so I shouldn't be discouraged by that and start to make radical adjustments to my list just because I'm losing to a thing that I think is I have a good chance of losing to. But if I have on the flip side a matchup that I think should be very favorable, and then things keep going wrong, then maybe you make bigger adjustments faster. So I guess the point I'm making is it depends.
Sure.
That's
No,
like
that's
kind of
fair.
a
That's fair.
cop out of an answer, but you have to make the judgment call and try and figure out exactly where your list is and is it doing roughly what you think it should, and if it's not, how far off the mark are you? Because sometimes you'll be really off the mark, even if you're playing something that should be good. Like I forget who says this, but there are people who say that playstyles are fake. I disagree. I think that playstyles are very much a thing, and I have definitely in the past made the mistake of playing, to use the Space Marine example, John Lennon lists that I understand how they work, and they work really well if you're John Lennon, but then I forget that I'm not John Lennon. And so for me, they don't work as well as they do for
Yeah.
him. And so just find something that matches your style and that assumes you know what that is, which is a
Yeah. Of
separate
course.
conversation that I don't know if we want to dive into because that's another topic entirely. But yeah,
Yeah, I think it's a process, right? Like as you
yeah,
play more and more games of 40k, you'll generally lean towards different things, but and like test yourselves, and sometimes you'll enjoy things. I know, like on this Nurgle Demons list, it's become making the rounds around Australia. Like it's just becoming more and more popular. It's a very primary denial style of
I
thinking,
would
and
find that
but I've heard
so boring to play.
I'm literally like about to try and play some games with it, and I'm like not looking forward to it. I was like, oh, but I was like, I
Oh,
really should learn how it does. Yeah,
about a year ago, I had a very unfortunate Death Guard period where I gaslit myself into thinking that I should play Death Guard. And don't get me wrong, Death Guard is and was a fine army, and even a strong one in the right circumstances.
yeah.
Not for me though. I did
No.
not enjoy those three tournaments that I took Death Guard to.
You got your toolbox army, you got your 10-10s, your 11-9s, and
Oh,
you're like, yeah, okay.
yep. As you take your lunchbox and you go to work and you punch in and you punch out and you get your 10, and that's just not me.
uh, just like Votan, so it's fantastic.
Yeah.
And so during those, so also during those practice games we were talking about before. So what sort of lists or archetypes will you try and play against? Will you try and play against maybe the very meta builds or the very strong things, or will you try and go for those use like WTC teams technology, white greens, dark greens to boost your ego and say yes, I can actually win these games, or will you try and go for your reds and oranges?
That really depends what the goal is, as you alluded to. But
Yeah,
assuming that you're not a WTC player, because most people aren't,
yeah, that's
assuming you're
true.
going for a GT, like I have a
Yeah,
GT like every month that I go to, basically. So if you're preparing for a singles tournament, I think you should play against the most difficult matchups. Because my point of view on this anyway is if the quote unquote easy armies, the less strong armies, if I can't beat them, well, what's the point? What I need to beat
sure.
is the good players in my meta. They're going to be playing the good armies. They're going to be playing the meta armies, and so I need to be able to beat those players if I want to win the event. My closest friends around here, uh, like one of them will always be on guard, so I need to practice into guard because there's gonna be a great player on guard, and then another one will play Eldar, and so there's gonna be a great player on Eldar, and odds are if I go to the event, I'm gonna run into one or both of them at some point. So I like to stress test as hard as I can, meaning I want to play the hardest games possible and see how that goes. Now, of course, if you're practicing for a team event, that's different because at a team event, if you have uh, a very hard matchup, you can just go, I'm never going to play that. So I'm going to pretend it doesn't exist. That's a different philosophy for different type of playstyles. But if I'm in singles mode, which I am for most of the year, then I want practice against the hardest possible matchups because if I can beat those, it means I can win the event, even if it's just an outside chance. But if I feel like I have no game at all, then maybe I switch to a different army.
Yeah, sure. And I guess to sort of split the question a little bit. So obviously we were talking about armies before. What about missions and sort of deployments? Will you try and play the harder deployments and missions traditional, or will you play a very stock standard crucible battle, take and hold to try and even the playing field? What do you try and do?
So this maybe is gonna sound weird, but because I go to so many GTs, I usually have the pack for the next one for during my practice
Yeah,
game. So I'll just play whatever is round 4 and 5 of that next GT, um, which is probably the most practical way you could do it, actually. When I think about it. Like if you're
yeah,
gonna be if you're planning for your hardest games at the event to be late in the event, and you've got constantly got events coming up as I do, then you just grab the pack for the next one, play whatever rounds 4 or 5 of that event is going to be. And if you've got the luxury of playing a lot of practice games, and sometimes that's the case, then just work through every round of the event. If you have a
yeah.
five round event coming up and you've got 5 practice games lined up, just go 1 through 5.
Yeah. And then what about tables and stuff like that? Like, obviously, sometimes you play in like Games Workshop layouts and stuff like that, and other times on WTC layouts. Will you generally play like a medium WTC layout or like a very balanced one, or will you try and make it harder for yourself?
Yeah. That's a tough one because again, usually I have an upcoming event with terrain layouts out, so I can just go. We're going to
Yeah,
practice for this
sure.
round on that
Yep.
table. But for some people, it's not a question. Some people play exclusively WTC. Some people play exclusively GW. For me, where I'm at in my meta, we alternate. So my next event is going to be on GW. And the list that I've been mainly playing for the last couple of months, which is Space Marines Gladius, I feel really shines on WTC because the movement tricks of Gladius make it particularly good, in my opinion, on WTC boards. So you do have to adjust your expectations a little bit because the terrain styles are very different. But because we're ramping up WTC season now, most of my games will be practiced on WTC terrain. And then what we usually do is, unless it's in an organized scrim, we will just randomize one of the mediums and just
Yep.
figure out like just randomly pick one. If I was playing an army that's more of a say traditional first defender and I knew that I was always going to pick a light or always pick a heavy, then I would try to focus my training on that. But that's usually not my role in a team, so that's not what I do.
Yeah, no, fair enough. No, that's good advice there. And so I guess to sort of backtrack a little bit. So you talked previously a bit about play styles and stuff like that. And obviously, working out your play style is a whole other conversation. But what are some tips and tricks that you would provide for someone who is trying to learn a new army and getting into it? What are some maybe traditional things that that you think would be good for people to look for that provides depth and interest for them, and they're not going to start playing games and then hate it immediately?
Yeah. I think every Warhammer player eventually figures out what kind of play style they like to play. So for me, I like fairly aggressive armies. I do not. I like
Yep.
to ask questions. I do not like to answer questions. And so I like to give my opponents problems to solve and then exploit whatever mistakes they might make in solving those problems. On the flip side, some players love to sit and wait and then solve problems that their opponents give them. And it's going to take a fairly long time if you're a new player to figure out which side of that fence you sit on. And sometimes it's possible that you can be good at both. The best Warhammer players in the world are good at both. And I'd like to think that I'm okay at answering questions. I just know that I'm better at asking them. And so whenever I switch to a different faction, I tend to default to the aggro playstyle of that faction. So when I went to
Of
GSC, I
course.
didn't play Host. Well, actually, I did play a couple of practice games of Host, and I understand how it works, and I know how powerful it can be. But I also know that that's not what I like to do. I went to Biosanctic because I'm like, I just want to
Yep.
jam some Gene Stealers and Aberrants down your throat and then see how you react to that, right? That's what I want
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
do. And so when I switch to a different army, I tend to pick the detachment that fits my style or switch to an army because I think it fits my style. And to go back to the example I was giving earlier, when I, for teams reasons, by the way, gaslit myself into playing Death Guard, it was because I could understand exactly what Death Guard could bring to a team and how
Hmm.
strong it could be in a team comp. And I was like, all right, our team I think would benefit from having Death Guard, so I'll do that. And I mean, I did fine. We still won the team event that we went to with that team comp, but I hated it. And so, and it's okay to like realize that something that you're doing you don't enjoy. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah. So, and then I guess how important is it for the army to have like quote unquote depth in terms of like detachments and units and variety when selecting an army for some of these people? Is it? Do you think it's important that it has some depth and variety, or is it more important maybe the play style and the models on the table is more important essentially? So, for
I
example, I
mean,
would say like World Eaters, for example, like World Eaters is pretty very small range in terms of models and units,
yeah.
and then has obviously limited detachments and only two right now. For someone maybe trying to learn a new army, like yes, you have a set style and parameters, but there's not much variety or depth to it. Whereas Space Marines, as we've alluded to or talked about before, has so much variety and depth to it.
Yes, arguably too much.
Yeah.
So World Eaters are actually the example I was going to bring up because they're one of my armies, and I've actually played them at a bunch of team events over the last couple editions since they became an army, basically, because
Yep.
they fit what I like to do very well. They get in your face and they just like ask a lot of questions, and if you can't answer those questions, you lose. I it's hard for me to like say you should. I think new players should play whatever army they think looks coolest because they're
Yep.
not gonna. It took me years to win my first RTT. Like very few people just immediately start out being good. I I remember when I started going to RTTs here in Ottawa. Chris Haynes, the back then and still current captain of Team Canada, was at all those RTTs, and for years I would pair into him and just lose until I finally won. And maybe I'm just slow, but I won my first GT after 3 years at least of playing competitive 40k. Like it was not an instant success story. So I think maybe we're asking the wrong question of new players and just basically look at the minis, figure out which ones you think look cool, because you're gonna lose anyway. And so you might
Yep.
as well lose with minis that you think look cool, and then from there figure out what you like. When I started in competitive 40k, I was playing Imperial Knights, and I don't enjoy Imperial Knights anymore. I still have the army.
Mm-hmm.
I played it at my first event in 10th because I was like I had too many rules. I need to like play two data sheets and just go from there. But it's not an army that right now vibes with me. But it's the first army
Sure.
that I ever played in competitive because I thought it was super cool that there were big stompy robots and that I wanted to paint the big stompy robots. So yeah, don't worry about it too much. I think people worry too much about playing the right thing early on when
Yep.
you don't know what the right thing is, so just play what you think is cool and then figure it out.
Yeah, that's very fair, and like yeah, it takes time to work it out and process, but
I mean,
that's
for me it
perfect
was
advice. Like if
years.
you
Not
no,
everyone can be
very
Anthony
fair.
Vanilla and immediately start winning
No,
super majors year one.
what a jerk! That's
I know,
super
right?
sneaky devil. Nah, and so you're talking about before. So your process of learning an army is like reaching out to people, getting information from them, and then watching some battle reports and maybe some reading of the data sheets. Have you? What are some of your other like Team Canada, obviously, or you can have a co-host processes for learning an army? Have you heard of different methods or philosophies that maybe people could apply?
So, like I said, some people just consume a lot of content and learn that way, and I think that's a valid way to do it. Especially
Yep.
nowadays, there's so many games being streamed, whether live from tournaments or battle reports, um, whether it be Art of War or whoever, that I think it's a perfectly valid way to learn how to play a new army. And I would even go as far as to say as that's how most people start learning new armies. That's not
Mm-hmm.
how I like to do it, not anymore, because I find that I'm um, in pedagogical terms, I learn best by answering problems. So if you give me
Mm-hmm.
problems and then I unpack and solve the problems, I will learn better that way. But that is not true of everyone. There are as many different learning styles as there are human beings, and some of us are more visual, some of us are more auditory, some of us are more like tactile. And for me, I need to play games. But that doesn't need to be everyone's method, and what works for me might not work for someone else. And so a lot of my friends, they will listen to a bunch of podcasts, watch a lot of videos, watch a bunch of streams, and just take the best ideas from all of those and combine them together in like an ideal Voltron, and then be very successful with that. It's learning is a very personal thing.
Yeah, and so how would you sort of, I guess, encourage people to try and learn better or find their solution for learning? Is it just practice and repetition, like just trying different methodologies and
Try
working it
everything.
out, or is there just try everything and then see
Yeah.
what works out?
Well,
I know
unless you so some people know themselves better than others as well.
of course.
Introspection and self knowledge is a very important yet rare quality. Very few of us know ourselves as well as we think we do, and I'm going to include myself in that. But unless you are very in tuned with your own learning processes, it's probably worth trying a bunch of things and just seeing what works. When I first started, I was watching so many bat refs, and I don't really anymore. But before I had the baseline knowledge of the game that I do now, it was giving me it was the worth from those bat refs was higher. And then eventually I
Yep.
realized that the time that I was investing in watching the YouTube videos and listening to the podcasts was bringing me less and less. And meanwhile, the value of playing games was increasing. And that speaks to my evolution as a player, I think. And that sort of learning journey is going to be ongoing for all of us, and hopefully none of us ever stop evolving in the way that we learn.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I couldn't put it better myself. So I can't wait till I don't know if you.
Can you tell I teach for a living?
Yeah. Felt like a uni lecture, that's for sure. So it's great. I was going to say, I can't wait for someone who's trying doing the learning style. I know very tradition, like some TV shows and movies, people like touching body parts or doing a dance to try and remember things. I can't wait for the Warhammer player who starts dancing trying to remember some.
Listen, if it works for you, do that. Yeah.
Yeah. Or like the very traditional like note cards. They have like the note cards right next to them. So, this is my stat line. This is what I should do. So I'm like, they're cramming for an exam. Yeah, the PTSD is throwing through me. So fantastic. Before we wrap things up, Francois, is there any final plugs or shout-outs you'd like to make, or any final comments?
Oh, well, I guess I should probably shout out my own podcast, although we also have been on hiatus recently. So if you're interested in hearing more of my dulcet tones, I am one of the co-hosts of the Canhammer podcast, so check that out. And of course, also I am a member of the Canadian WTC team, and so if you want to chuck us $5 on Patreon, please do. That's much appreciated. That gives you access to our Discord server. Other than that, just have fun with the game. That's all I want to say.
Nah, it's gotta win. What's the Conan quote?
I mean, winning's fun, but also,
Yeah.
and this is something that I think is very important, and part of the journey that every competitive player goes to is, um, it's okay to lose. And in fact, while we're talking about learning, I learn more from any of my losses than I do from my wins. Because when I lose, it's because something went wrong or I made a mistake. And so when you lose, don't be sad that you lost. Well, I mean, it's okay to be sad that you lost. I'm sad when I lose.
Of
We all
course.
are. But don't just be sad that you lost. Try and figure out why you lost and use it as a learning opportunity, because that's the only way that you'll grow as a player. If every time you lose, you lost because of the dice, then you're not learning as a player. And it's not true. You don't lose because of the dice all the time, and in fact, it happens very rarely that the only reason you lost was because of the dice. Although, when my Ragefield Warrior failed to kill at Talos at WCW, that's why I lost.
Average, mate. Absolutely average.
Yeah, exactly.
Have you just considered rolling better, Francois? I mean, I'm sure it had oaths and stuff like
Every
that.
once in a
Roll
while.
better, bro. Come
I mean,
on, what are you doing?
be right back. I'm gonna go put my dice in the microwave.
Yeah. You'll find them at the bottom of the toilet, right? That's where the best dice are.
Exactly.
So links for Ken Hammer and Team Canada are in the description down below, and I'll just chuck them in the chat as well for people. So really enjoy the Ken Hammer podcast, and I look forward to. And the Team Canada stuff is fantastic. I know you guys organise scrims internally within your Patreon, and have an amazing community and team. So it's great to see you guys keep progressing and promoting, and I look forward to seeing you guys in August. So fingers crossed, all things going well. I should be there in Austria, so it'll be great. I look forward to it.
Oh, I'm
So
so sad it's not in Belgium anymore.
yeah, I'm sad I don't get to visit Mechlin for WTC. Look, maybe I'll have to. Well, I'm sure there'll be many, many years to come.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll go back there, so that'll be great. Before we wrap things up, so obviously just quick self promotions on our end. So obviously this part of the Down to 40k network, we ourselves also have a Patreon. But if you guys are interested in events in the New South Wales region, you can sign up for as easy as $5 a month and get early access to tickets and other fun things along the way. We are also the official terrain sponsor of the Down 40k network is Tip Top Terrain. So Daniel Giri, the absolute legend he is, has an Etsy store. So Tip Top Terrains at Etsy. Descriptions for such in the description box down below. And greatly appreciate any support you can send his way. So yeah, that's it. So thank you very much, Francois, for your time tonight. Really, really appreciate it. I've learned a lot. It's been fantastic. And
Thanks for having me. It was great.
Playing across the tables in August or whenever.
Hopefully, yeah.
So even the virtual tables, we'll see how we go.
Of course.
So it'll be great. Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.
Cheers.
And up. There we go.